Paris in the middle of the 18th century was a city of contradictions. Along the Seine, the gilded facades of palaces shimmered, their gardens clipped to geometry, their fountains jetting upward in perfect arcs. But beyond those stone walls lay neighborhoods where the smell of damp straw and coal smoke clung to every garment, where gutters ran with refuse and the cries of vendors split the morning fog. It was in one of those cramped quarters, the Faubourg Saint-Antoine, that Marie-Louise O'Murphy was born in 1737. Her father, Daniel, had come from Ireland with defeat heavy on his shoulders. He was one of many Jacobite exiles who drifted into France after the Stuart cause collapsed. Once he had carried a sword for a lost king, now he carried debts. Paris knew his kind, men who boasted of noble lineage while pawning their coats for drink. Her mother, Marguerite, bore the harder burden, keeping children clothed and fed while the household teetered on ruin. The rooms they rented were narrow, with beams low enough that tall men stooped. Mice rustled in the straw mattresses. The single window opened onto a street where chamber pots were emptied from above with a warning cry. Marie-Louise grew up among the noises of the street, iron hammers clanging in the workshops, hawkers bellowing, hot chestnuts, apples, fresh milk, and the rumble of carts carrying wood to wealthier households. She was the sixth daughter in a brood of many, and from the start she understood that beauty could be a coin. Neighbors noticed her pale hair, her green eyes, her small, almost delicate frame. By the age of 12 she had learned how men's gazes lingered too long, how her sisters whispered of offers made and favors traded. For the poor, there were only narrow passages out of misery, a convent, a trade, or the attentions of a man with means. At night, when the candles guttered out and the street went black, Marie-Louise listened to her mother recite scraps of old Irish songs. Sometimes her father returned with his breath heavy with brandy, grumbling of fortunes squandered, of kings betrayed, of the nobility of their blood. His daughters eyed one another across the smoky fire, measuring how much nobility could be bought for the price of bread. By the 1750s, Paris was a city swollen with talk of pleasure. In the Polaroil gardens, powdered men and jeweled women strolled beneath lime trees. In the opera houses, chandeliers showered light over satin gowns, and in the gambling salons fortunes changed hands in the space of a heartbeat. The king himself, Louis XV, had turned the court into a theater of desire. Married to Marie Lesksinska yet bored by the piety of his queen, he sought diversion in a series of mistresses, some ennobled and famous, others plucked from obscurity. It was an age that praised youth as if it were a delicacy. Poets wrote verses about the blush of a girl not yet grown. Painters caressed with brushstrokes the curve of an adolescent shoulder. Families without money learned to see their daughters as possible rungs on a ladder of fortune. Paris was filled with intermediaries, tailors, actresses, fortune hunters, who knew how to present a pretty child to the gaze of a wealthy man. Marie-Louise's sisters had already drifted toward that world. One sang in taverns, another lingered among artists' studios where the scent of turpentine and tobacco filled the air. It was through those circles that a painter, François Boucher, the celebrated decorator of Versailles, heard of the Irish girl with hair like wheat. His studio, filled with draperies of pink silk and mythological sketches, was a place where beauty was constantly turned into currency. When she was 14, Marie-Louise entered those rooms. The model's platform smelled of varnish. A brazier hissed to keep the chill away from bare skin. Boucher arranged her body not as a child's but as a nymph's, hips tilted, gaze half averted, limbs arranged for languor. Canvas after canvas preserved her, most famously the reclining nude that would later hang in the private apartments of the king. The portrait was not simply art. It was a signal. In Versailles, whispers traveled faster than carriages. The king was weary of Madame de Pompadour, who, though still his confidant, was no longer his lover. The courtiers who fattened themselves on royal favor knew that a girl's face could open doors more quickly than a petition. Thus it was that one spring evening in 1752, as the light bled gold over the Seine, a carriage arrived for Marie-Louise. Its wheels splashed through puddles as it carried her away from Saint-Antoine, past the bridges where beggars stretched out their hands, past the shuttered shops where bread loaves were locked away from the poor. She sat among cushions she had never touched before, her dress freshly laundered by her mother, her eyes wide with a mixture of dread and expectation. The road to Versailles was long, lined with chestnut trees just beginning to bloom. Inside the palace, the air smelled of beeswax and perfume, of hundreds of bodies pressed together in corridors heavy with damask. Every surface gleamed, gilded balustrades, mirrors so tall they doubled the space. Servants in livery hurried past with trays, careful not to meet her eyes. Louis XV was 45 then. His face, though still handsome, carried the lines of indulgence. He had hunted that morning, and the scent of leather and horse still clung to him. Courtiers stepped back as he entered, their bows deep, their voices hushed. When his gaze fell upon the girl, there was a pause, then a faint smile. Marie-Louise curtsied as she had been instructed. Her knees trembled beneath the borrowed gown. She was aware of her own youth, as if it were a costume too tight across the chest. The king asked a question in a voice both gentle and distant. Had she been in the countryside before? Did she enjoy music? Would she take some sweetmeats? The words seemed ordinary, yet around them hovered an air of possession, as if every question had already been answered by the mere fact of her presence. In the rooms of Versailles, time unfolded differently. Days were measured not by bells but by rituals, the king's rising, the king's hunting, the king's supper. For Marie-Louise, the hours dissolved into silks rustling, hands arranging her hair, tutors instructing her in etiquette. At night she lay beneath curtains embroidered with lilies, the weight of the palace pressing down like stone. She thought of her sisters in their smoky rooms, of her mother bending over laundry, and wondered if they envied her or pitied her. The intimacy that followed was not spoken of. No one asked the girl what she desired. Desire was presumed. Courtiers described her as a petite maîtresse, a passing fancy, another ornament in the king's collection of pleasures. Yet for Marie-Louise the moments were etched into her body with a clarity that defied words. The coldness of the marble floor on her bare feet as she was led across a chamber, the heat of the king's breath after wine, the way her heart hammered like a trapped bird. Outside the palace, pamphlets circulated mocking the king's appetites. Caricatures showed him surrounded by flocks of girls, a shepherd tending his harem. But none of those voices reached the inner apartments. There, silence was enforced by velvet, by fear, by the knowledge that a young woman could be lifted to splendor or cast into disgrace with equal swiftness. Marie-Louise remained for only a brief season. The king's eye wandered quickly, and she was soon replaced by others, girls scarcely older than she. Yet that brief time marked her forever. She left Versailles with gifts, gowns, jewels, a pension, but also with a reputation that would cling to her like a shadow. Paris whispered of the Irish girl who had been the king's plaything, the child turned courtesan. In the streets of Saint Antoine, women clucked their tongues while men smirked. For her family, the liaison brought temporary relief from poverty, yet it also bound them to the world of intrigue and scandal. For Marie-Louise herself, it was a collision between innocence and a society that did not recognize innocence as valuable. The France of the 18th century had made her fate possible. The laws granted fathers absolute authority over daughters until marriage, but poverty left little room for principle. The church preached chastity, yet courtiers winked at the education of girls scarcely beyond childhood. Painters and poets celebrated youth as an erotic ideal, and kings believed themselves entitled to the bodies of their subjects. In such a world, a 14-year-old could be carried from a squalid tenement to the gilded bed of a monarch, her childhood extinguished in the glow of chandeliers. Versailles never lingered over those it cast aside. One week a face might be illuminated by candlelight in the king's chamber, the next it was forgotten amid the rustle of new silks. Marie-Louise discovered this truth in the summer of 1753, scarcely a year after she had first entered the palace. She was 15 then, though in Parisian whispers she was already a woman who had known the king. Dismissal came quietly. A lady-in-waiting delivered the message with a perfumed smile, as though she were granting a reprieve rather than a sentence. His Majesty's affections had moved elsewhere. Marie-Louise was to be provided with a pension, her needs attended to, her future assured. No explanation, no ceremony of farewell. Just a soft closing of doors. The jewels she carried back to Paris glittered in their velvet cases, but to her they felt like stones. She returned not to the Faubourg Saint-Antoine, but to lodgings arranged by intermediaries, apartments where curtains blocked the noise of the street and servants appeared at her bell. Her mother came to visit, eyes wide at the gilded mirrors, hands trembling as she touched the damask. Yet beneath her astonishment lay calculation. This was fortune of a kind. One daughter's body had lifted the whole family. Society had words for girls like Marie-Louise. Petites maîtresses, filles entretenues, creatures of patronage who existed between respectability and disgrace. To some, they were ornaments of Parisian pleasure culture, as necessary as opera singers and actors. To others, they were warnings, proof of feminine frailty and sin. But whatever the judgment, the path forward was clear. She could not simply return to obscurity. A girl who had lain in the king's bed was forever altered in the eyes of the city. So arrangements were made. In 1759, when she was 22, Marie-Louise married Jacques Paulette de Beaufranchet, a soldier from the Auvergne. The match was less about love than about re-establishing her within the web of legitimacy. For Beaufranchet, marrying the former mistress of the king brought a sheen of royal favor, a pension, the possibility of advancement. For her, it meant a surname to cover whispers, a chance at stability. The wedding was modest compared to court fates, yet to a girl who had grown up among patched skirts and smoky hearths, it seemed a marvel. The church smelled of incense and beeswax. The guests murmured in satin and lace. Jacques was not unkind. He looked at her with curiosity rather than contempt, as though he saw both the shadow of Versailles and the fragile woman who had survived it. But the marriage was brief. Within a year Jacques was killed in battle, another casualty of France's endless wars with Britain. Widowed at 23, Marie-Louise found herself once again dependent on the currents of fortune. She had a child now, a son, and the world measured her not only as a woman, but as a mother whose lineage carried traces of royal indulgence. Paris in the 1760s was a city vibrating with change. Philosophes debated liberty in smoke-filled salons, pamphlets mocked clerics, and in coffeehouses men shouted over news from America. Yet beneath the talk of reason and enlightenment, old structures held fast. Girls were still married at 15, still cloistered in convents against their will, still bartered as pieces in family strategy. And in the palaces of the powerful, men continued to regard female youth as a delicacy to be consumed quickly, before it spoiled. Marie-Louise moved through this world like someone who had glimpsed its innermost machinery. She knew the way glances could be traded like coins, how favors were whispered in corners heavy with perfume. She had lived in rooms where tapestries muffled every sound, where the body was both weapon and vulnerability. Her later marriages reflected the precariousness of her position. She wed again to François-Nicolas Lenormand, Comte de Flaghac, whose fortune was greater, whose name carried more weight. With him she bore more children, balancing between the duties of a respectable wife and the indelible memory of her youth. Friends remarked on her beauty enduring into maturity, the trace of innocence now hardened into elegance. Yet the gossip never ceased. At dinners, when glasses clinked and violins played, someone would inevitably recall the Boucher painting of a reclining nude, the famous portrait whispered to have been modeled on her adolescent body. Men laughed, women pursed their lips. To them she remained both an object of scandal and a mirror reflecting their own society's complicity. The truth was that Marie-Louise's story was not unique. She was one among many. Paris was filled with girls whose families saw opportunity in their youth. The king's private retreat at Versailles, the Parc-aux-Cerfs, became notorious in the 1750s and 1760s as a place where carefully selected young women were housed for his pleasure. Some were scarcely older than she had been. They arrived by carriage, instructed in silence, rewarded with trinkets and pensions. When dismissed, they were married off, folded back into society with titles or dowries, as though the experience had been merely an apprenticeship. No one asked what those girls felt. Their voices are absent from the archives. What survives are contracts, pensions, marriage records, portraits. History preserved the transactions, but not the tremors in their chests, the moments when candlelight fell across their faces, and they realized their childhoods had ended. For Marie-Louise, the years passed into relative quiet. She managed estates, raised children, navigated the shifting tides of reputation. She witnessed the fall of Pompadour, the rise of Du Barry, the endless rotation of women in and out of Versailles. And when the revolution came, sweeping away the monarchy that had once consumed her, she survived, imprisoned for a time, then released, living into her 80s. But if she endured, it was because she had learned the lesson taught to every woman of her generation. Survival required adaptation to the desires of men and the judgments of society. The world around her had sanctioned a 45-year-old king taking a 14-year-old mistress because power excused all appetites. Clerics might frown, philosophes might joke, but the court functioned on the premise that the king's body was beyond reproach. And the people, for all their grumbling about corruption, still gawked at the spectacle, still whispered about the Irish girl whose portrait had once stirred the monarch's pulse. In the end, Marie-Louise O'Murphy became a figure at once ordinary and extraordinary. Ordinary, because countless girls were subjected to the same structures, married young, or traded to men decades older. Extraordinary, because her name was etched into paintings, pensions, and pamphlets, leaving a trace where most vanished without record. Her life, stretched across the century, bore witness to a society that wrapped exploitation in silk and gilding and called it grace. In a shuttered carriage rolling through Versailles at dusk, a girl no older than 13 clutched the hem of her dress. The satin scratched her wrists, the stays pressed too tightly against ribs not yet broadened by womanhood. She had been told she was going to serve in a household, perhaps to carry trays or learn sewing. Outside, lanterns swung on iron hooks, lighting the broad avenues where noblemen in plumed hats strode home from the hunt. When the carriage stopped, the door opened onto a high wall. Inside lay the Parc-aux-Cerfs, the king's secret domain. To the townspeople it was a place of whispers, a hunting lodge turned residence for a rotation of carefully chosen girls. Within its rooms, tapestries muffled the echo of footsteps, and windows were shaded so no curious eye could pierce the privacy. The girl was led through corridors smelling of beeswax and lavender. A matronly woman, the keeper of this discreet harem, showed her a chamber, a bed piled with embroidered pillows, a dressing table with gilded brushes, a crucifix hanging above. "You are to be obedient, modest, cheerful," the woman instructed. "You will want for nothing. You will speak to no one of where you are." Thus began an existence both gilded and claustrophobic. Meals arrived on porcelain dishes, lace gowns were laid out each morning, and music floated in from distant chambers. But the doors locked at night, and outside contact was forbidden. The girls lived like dolls, tended and displayed until summoned. When their season ended, whether after weeks or months, they were dismissed with trinkets or arranged marriages, as though nothing had happened. This was no isolated cruelty. It was an institution, normalized by those who benefited from its silence. Courtiers whispered of it with amusement, lampoonists scribbled satires, yet none dared confront the king openly. Louis XV, burdened by the rituals of kingship, sought refuge in youthful flesh. His ministers provided the supply. For families of the lower gentry or impoverished bourgeoisie, the prospect of a daughter noticed by the king was both terrifying and tempting. A pension could rescue siblings from hunger, could buy a dowry that otherwise seemed impossible. Some parents protested, sending daughters to convents to shield them. Others nudged girls forward, straightening their hair ribbons before the carriage arrived. In the convent schools, meanwhile, hundreds of young girls lived a different kind of captivity. Behind stone walls rising above the Seine or tucked into provincial towns, they passed their days in prayer, embroidery, and strict silence. The nuns trained them for piety and obedience, preparing them either for marriage or for the veil. At dawn, bells clanged. Girls shivered as they rose from narrow pallets, the chill of unheated corridors biting their skin. They knelt on stone floors for matins, lips moving over Latin words they scarcely understood. Lessons followed, catechism, music, needlework. A fortunate few practiced harpsichord or learned a little French verse, enough to charm a future husband. But beneath every lesson lay the unspoken truth. Their bodies were not their own. Fathers might withdraw them for marriage at 14, handing them to men thrice their age. Others would remain cloistered forever, their youth buried behind veils. One such girl, Jean, remembered pressing her palm to the cold window glass at age 12, watching a wedding procession pass in the street. The bride could not have been more than 15, her hair powdered, her gown heavy with brocade. Beside her rode a man whose wig was streaked with gray, whose jowls sagged from decades of indulgence. Jean whispered to her classmate, "She is a child." The nun overheard and struck her hand with a rod, warning that obedience, not judgment, was a girl's duty. Obedience extended beyond convent walls. Under the law, a father's authority was near absolute until his daughter married. Consent was a formality easily bent. Parental arrangements dictated unions more than affection ever could. In merchant families, a girl might be wed at 14 to secure a trade alliance. Among nobles, marriages cemented estates, dowries, and political loyalties. The cost was borne by the young. Diaries and letters, few but surviving, speak of trembling brides led to their wedding beds, of tears hidden behind fans, of girls too small for the gowns stitched for them. One provincial nobleman recorded proudly that his daughter had matured quickly, and thus could be married at 12. He wrote this as though speaking of livestock fit for breeding. Yet in Paris, amid the brocade and lace, such arrangements took on a veneer of glamour. Courtesans like Madame de Pompadour rose from modest origins to command influence at court, patronizing artists, shaping policy. Their success masked the countless nameless girls who passed briefly through the Parc-aux-Cerfs, their identities erased by discretion. Pamphleteers, emboldened in the 1760s and 1770s, seized on these contradictions. They ridiculed the king for his school of nymphs, portraying him as an old satyr devouring innocence. They warned that a monarch who consumed children's youth would one day consume the nation itself. The caricatures exaggerated, but the kernel of truth stung. In a society where paternal power was law, the king was simply the ultimate father, entitled to command the bodies of his subjects as he commanded their taxes. Meanwhile, in the cramped homes of Parisian artisans, daughters learned early that survival meant compliance. At 12 they carried water from fountains, at 13 they sewed shirts for wages, at 14 they might already be courted by men with whiskered chins and hands hardened from tools. Parents spoke of prudence, of alliances, of avoiding disgrace. Few spoke of choice. And yet, within this rigid world, moments of resistance flickered. Girls whispered to one another in dormitories, sharing fears and dreams. Some ran away from arranged matches, hiding with distant relatives or slipping into the anonymity of Paris's labyrinthine alleys. A few, extraordinary, found their voices in print, like Françoise de Graffigny, who dramatized the plight of young women in her letters, or Olympe de Gouges a generation later, who would cry out for rights denied. But such voices were rare, and most were drowned in the rustle of bridal gowns or the hush of convent prayers. The machinery of power was relentless. Painters like Boucher continued to immortalize adolescent softness on canvas, passing it off as mythological Venus or playful nymphs. Doctors argued in treatises that early marriage was healthy for girls, their bodies designed for childbearing. Priests reminded parishioners that obedience was virtue, and obedience meant yielding to fathers, husbands, and kings. Thus the cycle continued. Carriages rolled through Versailles gates, convent bells tolled, wedding contracts were signed in candlelit parlors. And each time, behind the parchment and pomp, a young girl felt her childhood slipping away. By the 1770s, Paris trembled with new voices. In cramped bookshops along the Quai d'Augustins, forbidden pamphlets slipped from hand to hand. Bound in cheap paper, smelling of ink and damp, they carried words that unsettled centuries of obedience, liberty, equality, reason. Coffee houses swirled with talk of Voltaire's wit, Rousseau's dreams, Diderot's encyclopedic assault on tradition. Yet even as men debated freedom, young girls were still led to altars beside husbands twice their age. The contrast was jarring. Philosophers discoursed on natural rights, while in households across France daughters bent their heads in silence, their futures decided in parlors thick with tobacco smoke. Marie-Louise O'Murphy, now in her 30s, watched these contradictions with a clarity honed by experience. She managed her household with the composure expected of a respectable wife, arranging suppers, balancing accounts, instructing servants. But she also remembered the locked chambers of the Parc-aux-Cerfs, the moment when a carriage had plucked her from childhood. When she heard men praise Rousseau's doctrine that women were born to please and obey, she felt the words like a familiar chain. At salons hosted by women of wit, Madame Geoffrin, Madame du Defa, Mademoiselle de L'Espinasse, ideas floated like perfume in the air. Candles flared in mirrored walls, violins tuned between conversations. Here, at least, women spoke as equals, steering debate, pressing philosophers for answers. Yet even in these rarefied rooms, whispers followed Marie-Louise. She was the former mistress of Louis XV, the Irish girl turned countess. A curiosity, a cautionary tale, a figure both admired and mocked. Outside those salons, discontent thickened. Bread prices soared, peasants groaned under taxes, pamphleteers sharpened their satires against the court. Louis XV's reign, once gilded with the charm of Pompadour, now sagged beneath scandal. His affairs with young girls at the Parc-aux-Cerfs became a symbol of corruption, a metaphor for a monarchy feeding on the lifeblood of its people. One biting lampoon depicted the king as a bloated satyr sprawled on a bed, surrounded by children in lace. The caption read, "He devours the youth of France as he devours her wealth." Copies circulated in smoky taverns, carried by students across bridges, hidden in aprons of market women. The laughter they provoked was tinged with bitterness. For the girls themselves, laughter was no comfort. Many vanished back into obscurity, married off to minor officials or soldiers. Some died in childbirth before they reached 20. Their names dissolved, leaving only a few, like O'Murphy, preserved by art or scandal. The silence of the rest was as heavy as the stones of Versailles. In 1774, Louis XV died of smallpox, pustules marking the face that had once smiled upon young mistresses. The stench of his decaying body filled the palace corridors, driving courtiers to flee. His grandson, Louis XVI, ascended the throne beside Marie Antoinette, a queen herself married at 14 to a man nearly 5 years older, dispatched across Europe as though she were no more than a diplomatic dowry. Marie-Louise, by then remarried and raising children, saw in the Austrian girl's pale face a reflection of countless others. Antoinette's gowns glittered with diamonds, yet her youth had been taken just as surely as the nameless children of the Parc-aux-Cerfs. The scale differed, the mechanism was the same. The 1780s brought hunger sharper than satire. Crowds stormed bakeries when flour prices rose. Mothers clutched infants, breasts dry, while officials muttered of poor harvests and royal feasts. In pamphlets, the image of the king's lust for young flesh fused with the image of his court's gluttony. Both devoured the people's future. Marie-Louise aged into a quiet dignity, yet the revolution soon swept her into danger. Aristocrats were marked for suspicion. Former courtesans of kings were not exempt. She was imprisoned during the Terror, her fate balanced on the edge of a tribunal's whim. In dank cells smelling of straw and sweat, she listened to the weeping of women who had once been hostesses, duchesses, wives. Some recited prayers, others cursed the men who had traded them like coins. Each morning the carts rattled through the streets, carrying prisoners to the guillotine. Heads fell in the Place de la Revolution while crowds cheered, the blade flashing like judgment. Marie-Louise survived, perhaps because her name was not high enough to draw bloodlust, perhaps because history had already used her body and discarded her. She emerged gaunt but alive, stepping back into a France where the monarchy was gone and the promises of liberty were loud but uneven. She lived long enough to see Napoleon rise, to see the court reborn in new splendor, to see the cycle of power and exploitation renew itself in altered form. Girls were still married at 15. Soldiers still claimed brides before marching to war. But the revolution had cracked something open. Voices of women demanding rights, demanding recognition, now echoed where silence once reigned. Olympe de Gouges wrote her Declaration of the Rights of Woman and the Female Citizen, insisting that if women could be led to the scaffold, they must also be admitted to the forum. For Marie-Louise, who had once been a child in the king's bed, these words must have carried the weight of memory. She knew what it meant to be silenced, to have her fate dictated by men who considered youth their entitlement. And though she did not join the chorus publicly, her very survival into old age was a testament to endurance. By the time she died in 1814 at 77, France had traveled from absolute monarchy through revolution, terror, empire, and back again toward monarchy. The world had changed, yet echoes remained, the same structures of power, the same appetites clothed in new uniforms. And through it all, the image of the 14-year-old girl reclined on Boucher's canvas endured, her body forever captured in a pose of languid surrender. Viewers admired the brushwork, the play of light on flesh. Few paused to remember that behind the art had been a child, drawn into a machinery of desire that stretched from palace chambers to the very heart of French society. In a narrow village church near Lyon, candles flickered over an altar decked with flowers. The bride's veil shivered as she walked, her hand swallowed by her father's grip. She was 15, her new husband 39. Guests murmured admiration for the dowry that would save his faltering estate. She heard none of it. Beneath the veil, her lips pressed tight as she counted each step, the rosary hidden in her palms slick with sweat. When the priest's voice declared them joined, she felt not union but enclosure, like a door closing behind her childhood. Across France, similar ceremonies unfolded with relentless rhythm. Girls scarcely taller than the candles on the altar bent their heads, their signatures shaky on marriage contracts, while men decades older affixed bold flourishes. Each parchment bore witness to the quiet erasure of youth. In the convent dormitories of Paris, girls whispered about these marriages as though about executions. They lay side by side on straw pallets, fingers brushing in the dark, trading rumors of who had been summoned home, who would be wed before the year's end. Some prayed for cloister, imagining safety in veils and prayers. Others prayed for anything but the cloister, knowing that life behind convent walls could be as suffocating as any marriage. One evening, the bell had just tolled Compline when a 12-year-old novice whispered to her neighbor, "If the king asks for you, your father will let you go." The neighbor turned her face to the wall, silent. Both knew it was true. The king himself, aging but insatiable, was never far from these conversations. In satirical engravings sold discreetly at markets, he was depicted as a wolf in ermine, eyes gleaming as he prowled among lambs. Housewives bought them for pennies, laughing nervously before tucking them beneath aprons. Laughter was safer than outrage. Outrage could invite suspicion, while laughter only confirmed that everyone knew. Meanwhile, in aristocratic salons, women of wit dressed in silk debated philosophy beneath glittering chandeliers. They questioned tyranny, championed reason, praised liberty. Yet even there, marriage contracts for their daughters were drafted at 14, 15, 16. The paradox hung in the air like perfume: emancipation for men, obedience for women. The revolution cracked this paradox open. In 1789, Paris swarmed with voices demanding change. Women marched on Versailles, feet blistered from the long road, their cries for bread echoing under marble colonnades. Some had been married off as children, others carried infants in their arms. Their fury was not only for hunger, but for centuries of silence. Among them could have walked one of the nameless girls once hidden in the Parc-aux-Cerfs, her body given to a king and then dismissed to obscurity. Perhaps she had married a clerk, perhaps she had died in childbirth, perhaps she marched now among the crowd, remembering the locked rooms where she had once been displayed like porcelain. The revolution gave no stage for such confessions, yet they haunted the air nonetheless. Marie-Louise O'Murphy, gray-haired by then, heard the roar of this new world from her own threshold. She had survived the machinery of the court, had worn the mask of respectability, had raised children beneath portraits that reminded her of her youth. Now she watched the monarchy itself dragged to judgment. The guillotine took queens as easily as courtesans. The same blade that silenced Marie Antoinette might easily have silenced her. In prison, where straw mattresses stank of mildew and iron bars cut the light into strips, she heard women sob through the night. Some were duchesses, their hands once ringed with jewels. Some were seamstresses accused of gossip. All were equal in fear. Each morning the carts rattled toward the scaffold. Feet shuffled on cobblestones, drums rolled, the crowd roared. And among the names shouted by criers were those of women married at 15, widowed at 20, condemned at 30. Survival, when it came, was not triumph but exhaustion. Released after the terror, Marie-Louise stepped into a France that had shed one set of chains only to forge another. Napoleon's rise restored pomp, reinstated patriarchal codes that bound women tighter still. The civil code declared wives subordinate to husbands, daughters to fathers. The revolution's promise of equality had stopped at the threshold of gender. Yet something had shifted. Women had marched, written, argued, bled. Olympe de Gouges had declared that if women could be executed, they must also be citizens. Though her head fell beneath the blade, her words endured, whispered in salons, copied in secret. The silence of centuries had cracked. In the countryside, mothers still pressed the heads of child brides beneath wedding veils. In the city, widows still bartered beauty for protection. But alongside these old rhythms came new currents: pamphlets questioning paternal power, plays ridiculing forced marriages, novels daring to imagine women choosing their fates. Marie-Louise, in her last years, lived quietly, an old woman who had once been a child in the king's bed. Visitors spoke politely of her past, as though it were an amusing anecdote from a decadent age. Few looked her in the eye long enough to see the shadow there, the knowledge of what it meant to be taken before one had chosen, to have one's body inscribed on canvas and in rumor, but never in one's own words. She died in 1814, as cannons thundered across Europe and France staggered once more toward monarchy. Her life had spanned regimes, revolutions, empires. Yet through all the upheaval, one truth remained: a society that clothed exploitation in silk and lace, that named obedience as virtue and possession as love, had left scars invisible in its portraits and contracts. In the quiet after her death, Paris carried on. Girls still walked to convent schools in stiff white caps. Carriages still rattled over cobblestones carrying brides scarcely taller than their bouquets. The city still smelled of coal and roses, sweat and perfume. But beneath it all lingered the memory of those centuries when the body of a 14-year-old could be claimed by a man of 45, excused by custom, sanctioned by law, adorned by art. And if one listened closely, to the rustle of convent straw at night, to the muffled sob of a bride beneath her veil, to the silence of a portrait's painted eyes, one could still hear the weight of that cost, borne quietly by the women whose lives had been written not in their own hands, but in the hands of others.